The throne room of the Volanthi Empire stretched upward like a cathedral made of starlight and crystal. And Princess Seraphine Velcora stood before her father with her head held high, even as her heart burned with shame. Emperor Valdros the Eternal sat upon his throne of living metal, his lavender skin glowing faintly in the light of 1,000 floating orbs. His silver eyes cold as distant moons as he looked down at his third daughter. "You have made your choice then," he said, and his voice echoed through the vast chamber like thunder rolling across an empty sky. "I have, father," Seraphine replied, and she refused to let her voice tremble, even though every noble in the court watched her with mocking smiles, hidden behind elegant hands. She had been given 2 options, and both were designed to destroy her in different ways. She could marry General Korvath, a cruel man 3 centuries her senior, who wanted her bloodline to strengthen his claim to power. Or she could accept a diplomatic marriage to a human, a creature from a primitive world that the Volanthi had only recently discovered. The Volanthi lived for thousands of years and stood 7 feet tall, with bodies perfected by countless generations of genetic mastery. Humans lived for less than a century and were small and fragile and utterly unremarkable by every measure the Empire used to judge worth. To marry a human was to become a joke, a footnote, a princess who had fallen so far that she might as well have ceased to exist. Seraphine chose the human. She chose exile over chains, and she chose mockery over becoming a possession of a man she despised. 3 weeks later, she stood in the landing bay of her private estate on the garden moon of Volanthi Prime, watching a small transport ship descend through the amber clouds. This ship carried her future husband, this human she had never met. This creature she had agreed to bind her life to simply because the alternative was worse. The ship landed with a soft hiss of engines, and the boarding ramp lowered slowly. Seraphine had expected something, though she could not have said what. Perhaps a delegation, or guards, or at least some attempt at ceremony from the human government that had agreed to this match. Instead, a single man walked down the ramp. He was short by Volanthi standards, barely 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed permanently slightly hunched, as though he carried an invisible weight. His hair was dark brown streaked with gray, cut short and practical, and his face was lined with the marks of what Seraphine assumed was age, though with humans it was difficult to tell. He wore simple clothes in dark colors, carried a single bag over one shoulder, and moved with a quiet economy of motion that struck her as neither confident nor afraid, but simply present, as though he existed in the world without needing to make any particular impression upon it. His eyes met hers across the landing bay. They were gray, those eyes, and very tired, and for just a moment Seraphine saw something flicker in their depths, something old and heavy and sad, before it vanished behind a wall of polite neutrality. "Princess Seraphine," he said, and his voice was soft but clear, as he bowed exactly as deep as protocol required, neither more nor less. "I am Elias Vance, and I am honored to meet you." That was all he said. In the weeks and months that followed, Seraphine learned that her husband was a man of few words, and even fewer demands. He asked for nothing, complained about nothing, and seemed content to simply exist in the spaces she allowed him. He was given quarters adjacent to hers, and he spent most of his time there reading books from Earth that he had brought with him. Strange stories, written in a language she did not understand, about wars and loves and losses that meant nothing to her. He also gardened. On the balcony of his quarters, he built small containers of soil and planted seeds that he had carried across the stars. Seraphine watched him sometimes from her window as he knelt in the dirt, with his hands buried in the earth, tending to tiny green shoots with a patience that seemed almost sacred. He cooked as well, strange human foods with names she could not pronounce. And one evening, he left a covered dish outside her door with a small note that read simply, "In case you are hungry." She ate it alone in her room and discovered that it was delicious. Some kind of pasta in a red sauce that tasted of tomatoes and herbs, and something she could not identify, but that made her think of warmth and comfort. She sent him a message thanking him, and he replied with a single word: anytime. The court laughed about her marriage, of course. They called Elias her pet, her toy, her little human, and they wondered aloud what possible use she could have for such a creature. Seraphine heard the whispers and felt the sting of them, but she also noticed something strange. She did not mind coming home. Her estate had been a place of loneliness before, a gilded cage where she waited for her life to mean something again. But now there was a presence in it that asked nothing of her and judged nothing about her. Elias never questioned why she came home late from political meetings, with fury in her eyes. He simply made tea and set it on the table near her, and returned to his book without a word. He never asked why she sometimes stood on her balcony at night, staring at the stars, with tears running down her face. He simply appeared beside her once, with a blanket that he draped over her shoulders, before disappearing back inside. He never tried to be her friend, or her lover, or her confidant. He simply existed in her space, with a gentleness that she had never experienced from anyone in her long and political life. One night, 6 months into their marriage, Seraphine found herself sitting across from him at dinner, a dinner he had cooked because he seemed to find joy in cooking, and she realized that she was curious about him. "Elias," she said, and he looked up from his meal with those tired gray eyes. "What did you do before this, before you came here?" He was silent for a moment, and something moved behind his expression, like a shadow passing beneath the surface of still water. "I was a soldier," he said finally, "a long time ago, and then I was not, and then I was nothing in particular, and now I am here." "That is not really an answer," Seraphine said. "No," Elias agreed, and he almost smiled, just a small movement at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose it is not." He returned to his meal, and Seraphine let the question go, filed it away, in her mind, like a puzzle piece that did not yet have a place. Her quiet human husband had secrets, and she found that she wanted to know them. She did not know yet that those secrets would save her life, or that the tired man who tended gardens and made pasta would one day stand between her and death with a blade in his hand and the cold light of a killer in his eyes. She did not know that she had married a ghost, a legend, a reaper of earth who had walked away from blood and war, only to find that war would follow him even to the stars. All she knew was that she was not unhappy, and in a life filled with political games and family betrayals, and the endless cruelty of empire. That was more than she had ever expected. Seraphine woke to the sound of something she could not identify, a wet noise followed by a soft thump, and then silence that felt wrong in a way her sleeping mind could not explain. She opened her eyes in the darkness of her bedroom and saw a shadow standing between her and the door. For one terrible moment, she thought the shadow had come for her. But then her eyes adjusted, and she realized the shadow was Elias, and he was standing perfectly still, with something in his hand that caught the faint light from the window. "Do not move," he said softly, and his voice was different than she had ever heard it, flat and cold, and utterly without the gentle tiredness she had grown accustomed to. Seraphine did not move. She watched as Elias crossed the room to the far wall, and did something she could not see in the darkness, and then he touched a panel, and the lights came on at their lowest setting. 3 bodies lay on the floor of her bedroom. Volanthe, dressed in black combat suits that absorbed light, and they carried weapons that Seraphine recognized as neural disruptors, tools designed to kill without leaving a mark. These were shadow stalkers, genetically enhanced assassins that served the military elite, and they were very, very dead. Elias stood over them with a blade in his hand, a simple thing made of plain steel with a worn leather handle. And there was blood on the blade and blood on his hands, but none on his clothes and none on his face. His expression was empty. That was what frightened Seraphine most, not the bodies, not the blood, not the realization that assassins had been in her bedroom while she slept. It was the look on her husband's face, the complete and total absence of anything human in his eyes. "How?" she whispered, and her voice came out as barely a breath. Elias looked at her, and for a moment he seemed very far away, and then something shifted in his face, and the tiredness returned, and he was just Elias again, her quiet husband who grew tomatoes on the balcony. "Go back to sleep," he said, and he began to clean his blade with a cloth he produced from somewhere. "I will handle this." "How can I possibly sleep after—" "Then do not sleep," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, but no comfort either. "But stay in your room until I return, and do not contact anyone, and do not answer your door for anyone except me." He was gone before she could respond, dragging one of the bodies with him, as though it weighed nothing at all. Seraphine sat in her bed with her heart pounding, and her mind racing, and she did not sleep. She watched the door, and she waited. And when Elias returned 2 hours later with clean hands and clean clothes, and no evidence that anything had happened, she was ready with questions. He answered none of them. "A security malfunction," he said, when she demanded to know what he had done with the bodies. "That is what the official report will say, and that is what you will tell anyone who asks." "You killed 3 shadow stalkers," Seraphine said, and she heard her own voice shaking with something that was not quite fear. "Those are the most dangerous assassins in the Empire, and you killed them with a steel blade while I slept 10 feet away. Who are you?" Elias sat down in the chair across from her bed, and he looked older than she had ever seen him, older and more tired, and infinitely sad. "I told you," he said, "I was a soldier." "That was not soldiering," Seraphine said. "I have seen soldiers fight. What you did was something else entirely." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke in a voice so soft she had to lean forward to hear him. "On Earth," he said, "there is an organization that does not officially exist. They call us Reapers, and we are trained from childhood to do one thing very well, and that thing is killing. I served for 22 years, and then I stopped, and I came here because I wanted to find a place where I would never have to be that man again." Seraphine stared at him. "You are an assassin," she said. "I was," Elias replied. "I am not any more. I am a gardener now, and a cook, and apparently a husband, and I would very much like to remain those things if the universe will let me." "But it will not," Seraphine said, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Someone sent those assassins. Someone wants me dead." "Yes. Do you know who?" Elias looked at her with those gray eyes, and she saw the shadow of the killer beneath the surface, patient and watchful. "I have suspicions," he said. "The shadow stalkers serve the military elite, and there is only one man in the military elite who would benefit from your death. General Korvath." The name hung in the air between them like poison. Seraphine had refused to marry him, had chosen a human over him, had made him a laughingstock in the eyes of the court. Of course he would want revenge, and of course he would want her removed from the game entirely. "He is making a move for the throne," she said, and pieces began to fall into place in her mind. "My father is old and growing weak, and my brothers are cowards, and Korvath needs to eliminate anyone who might oppose him." "That is my assessment as well," Elias said. "Then I need to stop him," Seraphine said, and she felt something ignite in her chest, something that had been cold and dead for years. "I cannot let that monster take the Empire. He will burn everything my mother built, everything good that remains." Elias watched her with an expression she could not read. "That would be dangerous," he said. "I know," she replied. "You would be making an enemy of the most powerful general in the Volanthi military." "I know," she said. "You would need help," Elias said. The kind of help that does not appear in official reports. Are you asking me for that help, Seraphine? It was the first time he had ever used her name without her title, and something about the way he said it made her heart beat faster. Can you give it? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. The man who wanted peace, fighting against the ghost of what he had been. I did not want this, he said finally. I came here to rest. I came here to forget. I came here to die slowly in a garden, surrounded by things that grow instead of things that bleed. I know, Seraphine said, and I am sorry. Do not be sorry, Elias said, and something changed in his voice, something hardened and sharpened, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. Be ready, because if you are asking me to be what I was, then you need to understand what that means. I will not fight your battles for you, but I will remove the obstacles in your path, and I will do it in ways that will give you nightmares if you think about them too carefully. I understand, Seraphine said, though she was not sure she did. No, Elias said, and he stood and walked to the door. You do not, but you will. He paused at the threshold and looked back at her. Get some rest, princess, he said, and his voice was gentle again, tired again, human again. Tomorrow we begin. She watched him go, and she did not sleep that night, and when dawn came she rose and dressed and walked to the balcony where her husband was already tending his tomatoes, with dirt on his hands and peace in his eyes. She stood beside him and said nothing, and he said nothing, and together they watched the sun rise over the garden moon. War was coming, but for now there was silence, and Seraphine found that she did not want to face what came next alone. The months that followed were filled with shadows and whispers, and death that came silently in the night. Seraphine moved through the imperial court with new eyes, seeing the webs of alliance and betrayal that she had been blind to before. And everywhere she looked, she found traces of General Korvath's influence spreading like poison through the veins of the empire. Her father, the emperor, grew weaker with each passing week, his silver eyes dimming, his movements becoming slow and uncertain. The court physicians could find no cause, but Seraphine knew poison when she saw it, slow poison administered by hands that Korvath controlled. Her eldest brother Valdric pledged his support to the general in exchange for promises of power. Her second brother, Therion, simply vanished one night, and when Seraphine searched for information about his fate, she found only silence. She was alone in her family now, the last of her mother's children who still remembered what the empire could be instead of what it had become. But she was not alone entirely. Elias worked in ways she could not see and did not fully understand. He would disappear for hours at a time and return with dirt under his fingernails and tiredness in his eyes. And the next morning she would hear news of accidents and mishaps that seemed random but were not. A supply depot that served Korvath's private fleet caught fire and burned to ash. A communications officer who handled the general's secret messages was found dead in his apartment, apparently a victim of heart failure, despite being only 40 years old. 3 generals who had pledged loyalty to Korvath quietly withdrew their support after receiving visits from a human who spoke softly and carried no visible weapons, but left them pale and shaking. Seraphine never asked for details, and Elias never offered them. She understood that there was a wall between them now, a necessary wall, because on one side was the princess who could claim ignorance, and on the other side was the Reaper, who could never wash the blood from his hands, no matter how many gardens he tended. But even with the wall between them, something was changing. She found herself seeking his company more and more, not for information or strategy, but simply for the comfort of his presence. She would sit in his garden while he worked, and they would talk about nothing important, about books and food and the strange ways that human customs differed from Valanthi traditions. He told her about Earth, about blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched beyond the horizon. He told her about rain, which Volanthi Prime did not have, and about snow, which she could not imagine, and about a small house by a lake, where he had lived once before everything changed. "What happened?" she asked one evening, as the sun set behind the clouds. Elias was quiet for a long time, his hands still buried in the soil. "I had a wife," he said finally, "and a daughter. They were killed by people who wanted to hurt me, and I failed to protect them. And afterward I did things that I cannot speak of. And when it was over, I was empty." Seraphine felt her heart break for him, this quiet man who carried such enormous grief beneath his tired eyes. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," he replied. "It was a long time ago. I have learned to carry it, though I will never learn to set it down." He looked at her then, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared loss and shared loneliness that needed no words. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said softly, "not in appearance, but in the way you refuse to surrender, even when the world tells you that you should." She was stubborn like that, stubborn and brave and foolish in the most wonderful ways. Seraphine did not know what to say, so she reached out and placed her hand over his, her lavender fingers intertwined with his dirt-stained ones. He did not pull away. They sat like that until the stars came out, and something that had been broken in both of them began very slowly to heal. A war continued around them. Korvath grew more desperate as his plans unraveled. He could not understand how his carefully constructed conspiracy was falling apart, how his assets kept disappearing, how his allies kept abandoning him. He searched for the source of his troubles and found nothing, because the Volanthi had never encountered anything like a Reaper before. Humans were short-lived and fragile and weak. Everyone knew this. How can such a creature possibly threaten the greatest military mind of the Empire? But that was exactly what made Elias so dangerous. The Volanthi lived for millennia and learned their skills over centuries. They could not comprehend what it meant to compress an entire lifetime of training into a few brief decades, to burn with an intensity that longer-lived species never needed to develop. A human who dedicated 30 years to the blade had lived those years with a focus and desperation that no Volanthi could match. Every moment mattered. Every lesson had to be absorbed immediately. Every technique had to be mastered completely, because there was no time to waste. Elias had spent 22 years as a Reaper, and in those years, he had become something that the universe had never seen before. A perfect instrument of death, wrapped in the body of an ordinary man. Korvath finally discovered the truth through torture and bribery and sheer relentless investigation. He learned that the princess's human husband was not a pet or a joke, but a predator wearing the mask of prey. And he decided that if shadows could not kill her, then light would have to do the job instead. The message arrived at Seraphine's estate on a morning when the clouds were dark and heavy with coming storms. It was an official summons to appear before the Emperor's court on the Day of Ascension, the holiest day of the Volanthi calendar, when all the great houses gathered to renew their oaths of loyalty. "It is a trap," Elias said when she showed him the summons. "I know," Seraphine replied. "He will accuse you of something," Elias continued. "Probably treason. He has been gathering evidence, or manufacturing it, and he will use the court as his stage. I know." "You could run," Elias said. "I could get you off-world within the hour. We could disappear into the outer territories where even Korvath's reach cannot follow." Seraphine looked at him, and she saw the offer for what it was, a chance at survival, a chance at peace, a chance to leave behind everything she had fought for, and simply live. It was tempting. "No," she said finally, "I will not run. My mother died, fighting for what she believed in, and I will not dishonor her memory by fleeing like a coward. Whatever Korvath has planned, I will face it. Elias nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted, the tiredness fading, and something harder taking its place. "Then we face it together," he said. "You do not have to do this," Seraphine said. "This is not your fight. You came here to find peace, and I have given you nothing but war." Elias reached out and took her hand, and his grip was warm and strong and certain. "You have given me something to protect again," he said, "and that is worth more than peace." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a human gesture that meant more than any Valanthi ceremony could. "I love you," he said, and the words came out simple and honest and completely unexpected. Seraphine felt tears spring to her eyes, and she did not try to hide them. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not mean to, but I do." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his tired face into something almost beautiful. "Then let us go show an empire what that love is worth." The emperor's throne room was filled with 10,000 Valanthi nobles, dressed in their finest ceremonial garments, their lavender skin gleaming under the light of floating crystal orbs, their silver eyes fixed upon the raised platform where Emperor Valdros sat upon his throne of living metal. It was the day of Ascension, the most sacred day of the imperial calendar, when oaths were renewed and justice was dispensed, and the great houses displayed their loyalty for all to see. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Seraphine walked into that room with her head held high, and her human husband one step behind her. She felt the eyes of the court upon them, heard the whispers that followed in their wake, sensed the anticipation of those who knew what was about to happen. General Korvath stood at the base of the throne, resplendent in his military dress uniform, his decorations gleaming like stars across his broad chest. He was 7.5 feet of genetically perfected killing power, a warrior who had spent 3 centuries mastering the blade forms of the Valanthi martial tradition. He smiled when he saw Seraphine, and his smile was the smile of a predator watching prey walk into a trap. "Your Majesty," Korvath said, his voice ringing out across the vast chamber, "before the renewal of oaths, I must bring a matter of grave importance before this court. I accuse Princess Seraphine Velcora of high treason against the Empire." The crowd gasped, though many of them had clearly expected this. Seraphine felt the weight of 10,000 stares pressing down upon her, but she did not flinch. "What evidence do you present?" Emperor Valdros asked, and his voice was weak, his silver eyes clouded with illness and confusion. Korvath produced a data crystal and held it aloft. "I have here recordings of the princess conspiring with her human to assassinate loyal servants of the Empire," he said. "I have testimony from witnesses who saw her agents moving against military installations. I have proof that she has been working to destabilize your reign, Your Majesty, all in service of her own ambition." The evidence was fabricated, of course, but it was fabricated well. Korvath had spent months preparing this moment, and his lies were wrapped in just enough truth to be convincing. "This is absurd," Seraphine said, and her voice carried clearly across the chamber. "General Korvath is the one who has been plotting treason. He has been poisoning my father, eliminating his rivals, and positioning himself to seize the throne." The desperate words of a guilty woman, Korvath replied smoothly. "Your Majesty, I demand immediate judgment. The law is clear on matters of treason." Emperor Valdros looked between his daughter and his general, and Seraphine saw the confusion in his eyes, the weakness that the poison had wrought. He was not capable of seeing through the lies, not anymore. "The evidence will be examined," the Emperor said slowly, "and if it is found to be true—" "Your Majesty," Korvath interrupted, "the day of Ascension demands swift justice. Tradition allows the accused to name a champion to face their accuser in ritual combat. Let the gods decide the truth of this matter." It was an ancient tradition, rarely invoked, a remnant of a more barbaric age. The winner of such combat was considered vindicated by divine will, regardless of the actual truth. Korvath was offering Seraphine a way out, but it was no way out at all. He was the greatest warrior in the Empire, undefeated in 3 centuries of combat. Anyone she named as her champion would die, and their death would be seen as proof of her guilt. "Very well," Emperor Valdros said. "Princess Seraphine, do you accept trial by combat?" Seraphine looked at her father, and she saw how far he had fallen, this man who had once been mighty and terrible. She looked at Korvath, and she saw the triumph already gleaming in his eyes. She looked at the court, and she saw the vultures waiting to pick her bones. Then she looked at Elias. He stood beside her in simple dark clothes, no armor, no visible weapons, just a quiet man with tired gray eyes who barely reached the shoulder of the smallest Valanthi in the room. He looked utterly unremarkable, utterly harmless, utterly out of place in this hall of giants. He met her gaze and nodded once, a small movement that no one else would have noticed. "I accept trial by combat," Seraphine said clearly, "and I name my champion." She paused, and the court leaned forward in anticipation. "I name my husband," she said, "Elias Vance of Earth." For a moment there was silence, absolute and complete. Then the laughter began. It started as a few scattered chuckles and grew into a wave of howling mockery that crashed against the walls of the throne room. 10,000 Valanthi nobles laughed at the absurdity of it. This tiny human facing the greatest warrior their civilization had ever produced. Even Korvath laughed, his massive shoulders shaking with genuine amusement. "The princess has truly lost her mind," he said. "Does she send her pet to die as some kind of final insult?" Elias stepped forward. He moved through the laughing crowd like a ghost, drawing no attention until he stood at the center of the combat circle, and then suddenly everyone was looking at him, and the laughter began to fade. He reached beneath his coat and drew his blade. It was an ugly thing, that blade, just steel and leather, with no ornamentation, no energy field, no technological enhancement. It was notched in places and worn with use, and looked like something from a museum of primitive artifacts. But something changed when Elias held it. The tiredness left his eyes, and his posture shifted, and suddenly he did not look small anymore. He looked compressed, like all of his mass had been condensed into something denser and harder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Your Majesty," Elias said, and his voice was quiet, but somehow it carried through the vast chamber and silenced every whisper. "I have tried very hard to be a peaceful man. I came to your empire to tend gardens and grow old beside my wife. I wanted nothing from your politics, and nothing from your wars." He looked up at the emperor, and Valdros flinched beneath that gray gaze. "Your daughter showed me kindness when I expected none," Elias continued. "She gave me a home when I had lost everything. I would have been content to live out my days in her shadow, asking for nothing, causing no trouble." He turned to face General Korvath, and the general had stopped laughing. "But you threatened my wife," Elias said, and his voice dropped to something cold and hard and utterly without mercy. "So now you get to meet the man I used to be." Korvath drew his ceremonial blade, an energy weapon that hummed with barely contained power, a sword that had killed 100 enemies and never known defeat. "This will be quick, little human," he said, but there was something uncertain in his voice now. It was quick. Elias moved. The Valanthi were faster than humans. Everyone knew this. Their reflexes were superior, their perception more acute, their bodies perfected by genetic mastery over thousands of years. None of that mattered. Elias moved like nothing they had ever seen, not fast exactly, but inevitable. Each step and each cut flowing into the next like water flowing downhill. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just perfect economy of violence that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Korvath's blade swept down in a killing arc that should have bisected the human from shoulder to hip. It met empty air. Elias was already past him, already turning, already bringing his notched steel blade around in a strike that even Volanthi eyes could barely follow. There was a sound like a bell being struck, and then Korvath's sword hand hit the ground, with his blade still clutched in its fingers. The general staggered back, staring at the stump of his wrist, and Elias was already there, already pressing the edge of his blade against the giant's throat. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The throne room was utterly silent. "Yield," Elias said. General Korvath looked down at the human who stood before him, this impossible creature who had done what no warrior in 3 centuries had managed, and he saw death looking back at him from gray eyes that held no anger and no mercy and no pity. "I yield," he whispered. Elias stepped back and sheathed his blade, and suddenly he looked tired again, tired and small, and utterly ordinary. He turned to face Emperor Valdros, and he bowed, not deeply, not subserviently, but the bow of one warrior acknowledging another's station. "The gods have spoken, your majesty," he said. "My wife is innocent." The emperor stared at him, and for a moment clarity seemed to return to those silver eyes, a glimpse of the mighty ruler he had once been. "What are you?" Valdros whispered. Elias looked at him for a long moment. "Retired," he said finally. "I would very much like to stay that way." He turned and walked back to Seraphine, and the crowd parted before him like water before a blade, and no one laughed, and no one whispered, and no one dared to meet his eyes. He took her hand and squeezed it gently, and she saw that his hands were shaking very slightly, the only sign of what the moment had cost him. "Shall we go home?" he asked softly. Seraphine looked at the court, at her father, at the bleeding general, who knelt in defeat, at 10,000 Volanthi nobles who would never look at humans the same way again. "Yes," she said. "Let us go home." In the days that followed the trial by combat, the Volanthi Empire changed in ways that no one could have predicted. General Korvath's conspiracy unraveled like a garment with a pulled thread. Once he was removed from power, his allies turned on each other in their desperation to avoid punishment. And each confession led to another, each revelation exposing new depths of corruption and treachery. The evidence of his poisoning of the emperor came to light, and when the antidote was administered, Valdros began to recover his strength and his clarity. He looked at the empire he had nearly lost, and at the daughter who had saved it, and something shifted in his ancient heart. He also looked at the human who had defeated his greatest general in single combat, this quiet man who asked for nothing and demanded nothing, and simply returned to his garden as though he had not just rewritten everything the Volanthi believed about the younger species. "I do not understand him," Valdros said to Seraphine one evening as they walked through the palace gardens. "I have lived for 3,000 years, and I have never seen anything like what he did in that throne room." "Neither had anyone else," Seraphine replied. "How is it possible?" the emperor asked. "Humans live for less than a century. How can they develop such skill in so little time?" Seraphine thought about all the conversations she had shared with Elias, all the things she had learned about his species, and their strange, fierce grief lives. "Because they have so little time," she said finally. "They compress everything. They burn their lives like fuel because they have no choice. A human who dedicates themselves to something does so with an intensity we cannot match because we have never needed to. We have millennia to learn and grow, so we take our time, but they have only decades, so they take everything." Valdros was silent for a long moment. "We have underestimated them," he said. "Yes," Seraphine agreed, "we have." The emperor stopped walking and turned to face his daughter. I have underestimated you as well, he said, and there was something in his voice that Seraphine had never heard before. Something that might have been respect. You saw what Korvath was while I was blind. You fought him with nothing but courage, and a husband the entire court mocked. You saved this empire when your brothers fled or fell. I did what needed to be done, Seraphine said. Yes, Valdros said, and that is what rulers do. I have been a fool, Seraphine, and I have wasted you. I will not make that mistake again. In the months that followed, Princess Seraphine became her father's chief advisor, and slowly, carefully, she began to guide the empire toward change. The expansion wars were scaled back, then halted entirely. Treaties were offered to species that had been enemies for centuries. The genetic purity laws that had kept the Valanthi isolated were reformed to allow greater interaction with other peoples. Not everyone welcomed these changes. There were traditionalists who saw the princess as a corrupting influence, who whispered that her human husband had somehow bewitched her, who longed for the days of conquest and domination. But whenever opposition grew too bold, someone would remember what had happened in the throne room. They would remember the sound of Korvath's hand hitting the floor, and they would decide that perhaps the reforms were not so terrible after all. Elias returned to his garden and his cooking and his quiet life, just as he had promised himself he would. He attended state functions when required and stood beside his wife at official ceremonies, but he never sought power or influence or recognition. He was content to exist in Seraphine's shadow, supporting her in ways that no one else could see, being the anchor that kept her steady when the storms of politics threatened to sweep her away. Sometimes, visitors would come to the princess's estate, diplomats and generals and nobles from across the empire, and they would see the human kneeling in the dirt, with his hands buried in the soil, tending to tomatoes and herbs and flowers that he had brought from Earth. They would notice the way he moved, the economy of motion that suggested coiled power beneath a calm surface. They would notice the old steel blade that hung by the garden door, notched and worn and utterly plain. And they would be very, very polite to the princess. Years passed, and Emperor Valdros grew old, even by Valanthi standards. When he finally passed into the eternal silence, Seraphine stood before the great houses and accepted the crown that he had never officially given her, but that everyone knew she had earned. Empress Seraphine Valcora, first of her name, ruler of the Valanthi Empire, beloved of her people. And beside her, dressed simply in dark clothes that bore no decoration or title, stood her human husband, the gardener, the cook, the quiet man with tired gray eyes who had never asked to be a legend. The coronation ceremony lasted for hours, but finally it ended, and Seraphine found Elias in their private quarters, already changed out of his formal clothes, already kneeling in the balcony garden with his hands in the dirt. She sat down beside him on the cool stone and watched him work. "How does it feel?" he asked without looking up, "being Empress?" "Heavy," she admitted, "terrifying, and somehow right." He nodded slowly. "You will do well," he said. "Have always known what this empire could be. Now you have the power to make it real," Seraphine said. Elias finally looked at her, and she saw the love in his eyes, the deep, quiet love that had grown between them in the spaces between words and wars. "Yes, you could have," he said. "I just made it a little easier." She laughed softly and leaned against his shoulder, this man who had crossed the stars to find peace and found her instead. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he replied, and he kissed the top of her head and returned to his tomatoes. Decades later, long after both of them had passed from the world, a Valanthi historian named Therissa would write the definitive account of this period in imperial history. She would document the reforms, the treaties, the transformation of the empire from a conquering force into a cooperative commonwealth. But she would also write about the humans. She would interview survivors of that day in the throne room, gathering their accounts of what they had witnessed. She would research the history of Earth and its secret orders, and the impossible things that humans could accomplish when they devoted their brief lives to a single purpose. And in the final chapter of her book, she would write these words that would be quoted for centuries to come. "We measured them by their years and found them wanting. We measured them by their size and dismissed them. We measured them by their technology and judged them primitive. We never thought to measure them by their will, by what they could compress into a single burning lifetime." The human Elias Vance was never a threat to our empire. He was a warning. There are billions more like him on their little blue world, living their brief and furious lives, becoming things we cannot imagine because we have never needed to. They do not have millennia to master a skill, so they master it in decades. They do not have centuries to learn patience, so they learn to act with decisive fury. They do not have the luxury of time, so they treat every moment as precious and burn through their lives with an intensity that terrifies and humbles us. We called them primitive. We called them weak. We called them insignificant. We were fools. And any empire that forgets this lesson will learn it again, as Korvath learned it, in blood and defeat and the cold gray eyes of a gardener who only wanted to be left alone. The book became required reading in every academy of the Reformed Empire, and the name Elias Vance passed into legend alongside the empress he had loved. But perhaps the truest monument to his memory was simpler than any book or statue. In the gardens of the imperial palace on Velanthi Prime, there grows a variety of tomato that originated on Earth, brought across the stars by a quiet man who wanted nothing more than peace. The gardeners tend it carefully, generation after generation, and when visitors ask about its origin, they tell the story of a human who married a princess and changed the fate of empires. Not with conquests or weapons or great speeches, but with patience and love, and the willingness to fight when fighting was the last and only option. Only option left. They say that on quiet evenings, when the light is just right, you can almost see him kneeling in the dirt with his hands buried in the soil, tending his garden, waiting for the sun to rise.